A successful Texas lawyer, a devoted wife, a secret buried for 10 years. When she uncovered the truth, she never got the chance to tell anyone. When police arrived at the couple's luxurious Dallas home, they weren't prepared for what they found. Blood-soaked floors, a missing husband, and a discovery that would rip open a decade-old murder case. How far would someone go to bury their darkest secret? And when the truth finally surfaced, why did it cost an innocent woman her life? Stay with me, because this case is one of the most chilling you'll ever hear. Emily Carter was the kind of woman people admired. At 42, she had built a life centered around kindness, stability, and family. A devoted wife, a beloved schoolteacher. She was the type of person who never raised her voice, never held a grudge, and always believed the best in people. To her students, she was their biggest supporter. To her friends, a compassionate listener. And to her husband, Daniel Carter, she was everything. Or so she thought. Daniel, 45, was a highly successful defense attorney in Dallas, Texas. Sharp, calculated, and relentless in the courtroom, he had a reputation for winning cases that seemed unwinnable. Clients trusted him. Judges respected him. Colleagues envied him. And Emily? She was proud of him, proud of the life they had built together. Their marriage, at least to the outside world, seemed like a partnership built on trust and love. A power couple with no reason for concern. But appearances can be deceiving, because behind closed doors, something was shifting. Daniel had become distant, more secretive. His once charming and attentive demeanor had been replaced with irritation, paranoia, and an unshakable tension that lingered in their home. At first, Emily ignored it, convincing herself it was just work stress. After all, being a lawyer wasn't easy. Long hours, high-profile cases, pressure from clients. It all took a toll. But then, she started noticing things. The late-night phone calls he would immediately silence. The locked filing cabinet in his home office that he never used before. The way his expression changed whenever she asked about his past cases, especially one in particular. One evening, while cleaning his office, Emily stumbled upon something that made her stomach drop. An old, worn-out case file buried beneath stacks of legal paperwork. A file that shouldn't have been there. She wasn't one to pry, but something about it felt off. Her curiosity got the best of her. She sat down, opened the folder, and what she found inside made her blood run cold. Inside were crime scene photos, detailed reports, witness statements. But what shocked her the most was the name on the front of the file. Rachel Monroe. A woman brutally murdered in 2014. The case had gone cold, and police had never made an arrest. There were no clear suspects, no leads, no motive that anyone could uncover. And yet, here was her husband, with a copy of the case file hidden away. Why would Daniel have this? He wasn't a prosecutor. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't even involved in the case. And yet, as she flipped through the pages, she found something even more disturbing. Evidence logs, autopsy reports, and a forensic analysis of fingerprints found at the scene. Fingerprints that belonged to someone the police had overlooked. Someone she knew. Someone she had lived with for more than 10 years. Her own husband. Emily was no longer just Daniel's wife. She was now holding a secret that could destroy him. But what she didn't realize was that in uncovering his past, she had just sealed her own fate. After finding the case file, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tried to convince herself it was all just a coincidence. Maybe Daniel had represented someone connected to the case. Maybe he was keeping the file for professional reasons. But deep down, she knew better. The file had been hidden, tucked away beneath legal paperwork that had nothing to do with his current cases. And then there was the fingerprint analysis. A match, not for a suspect, not for a witness, but for her husband. For days, she debated what to do. Should she ask him? Should she go to the police? What if she was wrong? But as she watched Daniel closely, his behavior only made her more suspicious. He was jumpy, short-tempered, and more secretive than ever. The man she had trusted for over a decade was suddenly a stranger. And then, one night, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Emily waited until dinner, hoping to catch him off guard. She placed the file on the table between them, sliding it toward him without saying a word. Daniel barely glanced at it before pushing his plate aside. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a calm but chilling voice, he asked, "Where did you find this?" Emily's hands trembled as she told him the truth. She had found it in his office. She had read everything. She knew about Rachel Monroe. And most importantly, she knew about his fingerprints. Daniel let out a small, almost amused chuckle. Then, he leaned back in his chair, shook his head and said, "You shouldn't have gone looking for things that don't concern you, Emily." He dismissed her questions, called her paranoid, told her she was overreacting. When she pressed him for answers, he snapped, slamming his fist on the table and telling her to drop it. But Emily couldn't drop it. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, she did something she had never done before. She called her best friend, Sarah. And in a quiet, shaky voice, she said, "I think my husband is hiding something, and I don't know what to do." Sarah urged her to go to the police, but Emily hesitated. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. She wanted to believe the man she married wasn't capable of something so horrific. But 1 week later, Emily Carter was nowhere to be found. At first, Sarah thought Emily was just busy. Maybe she was working things out with Daniel. But when text messages went unanswered and phone calls rang endlessly, she knew something was wrong. Emily was never the type to ignore her friends. Something had happened, and Sarah wasn't going to wait any longer to find out what. She called the police and begged them to check on Emily. It took officers less than 15 minutes to arrive at the Carter home. The lights were off. The front door was locked. No answer. When officers knocked again, something felt off. The house was too still, too quiet. And then, they noticed something near the front porch. A smear of red blood. With no response from inside, officers forced the door open. What they found inside would haunt them forever. The living room was undisturbed, the kitchen untouched. But the moment they stepped into the hallway, the horror became clear. Blood everywhere. It covered the walls, soaked into the carpet, smeared along the doorframes as if someone had been dragged. And then, in the master bathroom, they found her. Emily Carter's body had been brutally dismembered. Her remains scattered in the bathtub, the floor, the sink. The walls painted in dark, dried streaks of blood. Whoever had done this didn't just want to kill her. They wanted to erase her. But the most chilling detail? Daniel Carter was gone. The crime scene inside the Carter home was nothing short of nightmarish. The sheer brutality of the attack, the gruesome state of Emily's remains. It all pointed to a killing fueled by rage. But amid the chaos, Daniel Carter had left behind a trail of evidence. Evidence that would expose not only the murder he had just committed, but one he had hidden for over a decade. The first and most obvious piece of evidence was the bloody kitchen knife found in the bathroom sink. Investigators immediately suspected it was the murder weapon. The handle had been wiped clean, an amateur attempt to remove fingerprints, but forensic experts knew better. They collected swabs from the blade and surrounding areas, confident that microscopic traces of DNA would tell the full story. But why the bathroom? Had Emily tried to escape? Had Daniel dragged her there? The placement of the body and weapon suggested that this was no spontaneous act. This was a controlled, calculated crime. As investigators combed through the house, they found something else. Emily's laptop, or what was left of it. The screen was shattered, the keyboard dented, and the entire device had been smashed against the floor with such force that the frame was bent. But there was one key element missing. The hard drive. Laptops don't just break apart like that unless someone is trying to destroy something. The hard drive was gone, likely taken by Daniel himself. Investigators believed Emily had found something she wasn't supposed to see, and whatever it was, it had been important enough for Daniel to not just kill her, but to make sure no trace of her discovery remained. Had she been searching for more details about Rachel Monroe? Had she uncovered something damning? Something that could finally expose Daniel for who he really was? Whatever it was, the missing hard drive suggested that Emily had gotten too close to the truth. And Daniel had silenced her because of it. But if Daniel thought he had covered his tracks, he was wrong. Police immediately turned their attention to tracking him down. Neighbors were questioned, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. No screams, no sounds of a struggle. It was as if the crime had happened in complete silence, reinforcing the theory that Daniel had premeditated the attack. He had waited for the right moment. He had ensured there were no witnesses. And once it was done, he had vanished. Fortunately, he hadn't vanished without a trace. Investigators got their first major lead from a surveillance camera at a gas station just a few miles from the Carter home. The footage, time-stamped at exactly 3:47 a.m., showed a black SUV pulling up to the pump. A man stepped out. Dressed in dark jeans and a hoodie, he kept his head low, his movements quick but controlled. He paid in cash, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. But despite his efforts to stay unnoticed, the camera caught a clear glimpse of his face. It was Daniel Carter. The timestamp suggested that he had fled the scene within hours of Emily's murder, reinforcing investigators' belief that this had never been a crime of passion. It had been planned. He knew he would need to leave town. He had packed, withdrawn cash, and disappeared into the night. The question was, where was he headed? As police worked to track his movements, a disturbing discovery surfaced from the evidence room. It had been sitting in plain sight for years, but no one had thought to connect the dots until now. The 2014 murder of Rachel Monroe. A case that had remained unsolved, with no official suspects, until Emily found that case file in Daniel's office. Rachel Monroe had been a 27-year-old paralegal at a firm where Daniel once worked. Bright, ambitious, and well-liked, she had been brutally murdered inside her apartment. Stabbed multiple times. Dismembered. The scene had been eerily similar to what police had just found at the Carter home. At the time, investigators had questioned several people, including colleagues, friends, and former clients, but no one had ever been arrested. The reason? Daniel Carter had an ironclad alibi. According to records, he had been out of town during the weekend of Rachel's murder, attending a legal conference in another state. Multiple colleagues had vouched for him. Without forensic evidence linking him to the crime, the case went cold. But now, investigators had something they hadn't had before: motive. Emily had found something in that file, something she wasn't supposed to see. Had she uncovered proof that Daniel's alibi wasn't real? Had she found records that had been doctored, witness statements that had been manipulated? The deeper investigators dug, the more the pieces fell into place. And then, the most damning piece of evidence surfaced: fingerprints. Back in 2014, investigators had collected fingerprints from Rachel's apartment, but at the time, there had been no matches. The prints didn't belong to any known suspects. But now, with Daniel Carter on the run, the prints were re-examined. This time, there was no mistake. The fingerprints belonged to Daniel. The moment those results came in, law enforcement knew they weren't just dealing with a man who had murdered his wife. They were dealing with a man who had been hiding his crimes for over a decade. A serial offender who had killed at least 2 women, and possibly more. The Texas Rangers, U.S. Marshals, and FBI joined the hunt, issuing a statewide manhunt for Daniel Carter. Every major law enforcement agency was now on high alert. But Daniel had a head start, and the question remained, where was he going? Experts believed he was heading south, likely aiming for the Texas-Mexico border. Crossing into Mexico would make extradition complicated. With enough money and the right connections, he could disappear entirely. But then, investigators uncovered something that turned the case on its head. Because Daniel Carter wasn't just running. He was planning. Daniel Carter wasn't just running, he was planning. And for nearly a week, he managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. While police were searching his home, processing evidence, and piecing together his connection to Rachel Monroe's cold case, Daniel was on the road, covering his tracks. He knew the system better than most. He knew how to avoid detection, but no matter how well he had planned, he made one critical mistake. He left behind a digital footprint. Despite his attempts to stay under the radar, investigators managed to track his phone to a secluded motel in El Paso, Texas, just hours from the Mexican border. The location made sense. If Daniel wanted to disappear, Mexico was his best option. A place where extradition could be complicated, where he could change his identity and blend in with thousands of others looking to escape their past. But there was one problem: he had stayed too long. By the time a team of federal agents and Texas Rangers arrived at the motel, it was nearly 3 a.m. They moved in quickly, surrounding the building, ready for anything. Would he go down fighting? Would he try to run? Would they find him alive at all? With their weapons drawn, they stormed into the room where Daniel's phone had last pinged. But what they found inside wasn't what they expected. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, the TV still on, playing late-night infomercials. But Daniel was gone. The only thing he had left behind was a single sheet of paper on the nightstand. A handwritten note that sent a chill through everyone who read it. It said, "The truth was never meant to come out. I did what I had to do." At first, investigators feared the worst. Had Daniel taken his own life? Had he managed to slip past them into Mexico before they even realized he was gone? Surveillance footage from the motel provided a partial answer. 1 hour before the raid, Daniel had walked out of his room, carrying a small backpack. He didn't run. He didn't act suspicious. He simply walked to the parking lot, got into a different vehicle, one that wasn't registered in his name, and drove off. It was clear he had help. Someone had given him that car. Someone had helped him get fake documents. And that meant someone knew where he was going. A nationwide alert was issued, his face plastered across news stations, social media, and billboards along the border. The FBI worked around the clock, trying to determine Daniel's next move. If he was heading for Mexico, there were only a few key crossing points he could use. It was a race against time. And then, just 24 hours later, they got him. It happened at a border checkpoint near Laredo, Texas. A routine inspection flagged a suspicious traveler. A man with a brand new passport, freshly printed, the ink barely dry. The name on the passport read Michael Gaines. But the face? The face belonged to Daniel Carter. When officers approached him, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply sighed, placed his hands on the counter and said, "I guess this is it, huh?" Daniel Carter, the man who had spent years hiding his secrets, had finally been caught. But what came next shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Because when they sat him down for questioning, Daniel did something no one expected. He confessed. Not just to Emily's murder, but to something much darker. Something they hadn't even considered yet. After years of hiding his crimes, after weeks of evading capture, and after days of intense interrogation, Daniel Carter finally broke. In a cold, emotionless voice, he confessed to everything. He admitted to killing Rachel Monroe in 2014. He admitted to fabricating his alibi, using his legal connections to cover his tracks. And most chillingly, he admitted that when Emily discovered the truth, he knew there was only one way to protect himself, by silencing her forever. She wasn't supposed to find out, Daniel reportedly told detectives. She wasn't supposed to know. That was the extent of his explanation. No remorse, no regret, just the calculated logic of a man who had spent his entire life manipulating the truth. But now, the truth was finally out, and there was no escaping it. A husband who butchered his wife to protect a decade-old secret. The courtroom was packed from the very first day. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and ordinary people who had followed the case from the beginning all sat in stunned silence as the prosecution laid out its case. For 6 weeks, the jury listened to testimony that painted Daniel Carter not as a brilliant lawyer, but as a man capable of monstrous acts. Emily's best friend, Sarah, took the stand, recalling the chilling phone call she had received just days before Emily's murder. "She told me she was scared," Sarah said through tears. "She told me she thought Daniel was hiding something. His defense team tried to argue for a plea deal, suggesting that Emily's murder had been a crime of passion rather than premeditated. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pattern was undeniable. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Guilty, on all counts. When the judge read the verdict, there was no reaction from Daniel Carter. No visible remorse. No acknowledgement of what he had done. He simply sat there, expressionless, as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the justice Emily Carter's family had been waiting for, but it didn't bring her back. After the trial, Emily's sister stood outside the courthouse, addressing the crowd of reporters. With tears in her eyes, she said, "My sister was trying to do the right thing, and she paid the price for it. She was brave, she was kind, and she didn't deserve this." In Emily's honor, her family launched a foundation dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and the dangers of hidden abuse. They vowed that her story wouldn't be forgotten, that no other woman would suffer the same fate. And as Daniel Carter was led away in handcuffs, one thing became clear. He had spent years building a life based on lies, manipulation, and murder. But in the end, the truth caught up with him. What do you think? Did Daniel Carter plan this from the very beginning, or was Emily's murder a desperate act of panic? Let's discuss in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. If you found this case as shocking as I did, make sure to hit that like button. And if you love true crime stories that dig deep into the most chilling cases, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new video. And trust me, this isn't the first time a high-powered lawyer has been caught in a deadly scandal. If you think this case was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in the next story. Click here to watch another chilling case that will leave you speechless.